Our investigation revealed that there simply wasn't enough information contained in the sample itself where you can make definitive conclusions one way or the other.
After an extensive investigation, the prosecution believed it had a clear picture of what really happened the night Bill Jennings died.
The argument started in the master bedroom of the residence and occurred, we believe, over the state of the relationship.
It probably started as a verbal argument that escalated into a violent argument. Blows were thrown.
David Stagg took an ornamental egg which had been stationed inside the master bedroom and began hitting Bill Jennings over the head with it.
David drug him around that apartment, put him down on that wrought iron birdcage, and held him there until Bill Jennings took his last breath. And then I think David Stagg realized what happened. He didn't know what to do. So David concocts this story about a suicide and sat down at that computer and typed a suicide note.
Prosecutors believe science proved their case.
We think that the expert testimony was particularly relevant and important.
It's unlikely that Mr. Jennings made that last suicide note.
The presumed assailant would have come out of this fight with possibly no marks of the struggle.
I found a pair of white jockey underwear in the trash. There was a salt compound in the underwear similar to bleach or detergent.
David Stagg was neither included or excluded.
The bigger picture pointed to his guilt when you look at all the pieces of circumstantial evidence.
But the defense stood by its own evidence and experts. They did not believe David Stagg was capable of murder.
There was no physical evidence linking David to the crime. In fact, that was the strongest part of our defense.
Both sides were now ready to present their cases in court.
When I saw the anger and rage in this man's face, I knew this is what Bill had seen that night that he was murdered.
But a startling outcome awaited a divided courtroom.
You build toward that climax, and it becomes a weight around your neck.
Who had murdered Bill Jennings? Experts for the prosecution and the defense had considered the forensic evidence.
It's not Mr. Stagg's print, but some other person.
There was no technical way for determining how old those latent prints were.
And they had arrived at very different conclusions.
David Stagg had no injuries at all, period.
It's possible that an assailant under these conditions could come out of the fight with no injuries.
A suicide note had caused much speculation.
I think it's unlikely that Mr. Jennings made that last suicide note.
It's very likely that Mr. Jennings was responsible for all the notes on that computer.
The story of a lover's quarrel had dominated the Kansas town for months.
It's a small community, and people do whisper.
In October 2006, after a long investigation, David Stagg stood trial for the murder of his partner, Bill Jennings.
David is highly respected by his colleagues, his friends, and his students. There were over 300 that rallied behind him.
I was just there to give my help as much as I could to bring about a conviction.
Friends of the victim and accused sat through a grueling and emotionally charged trial.
When you consider the other evidence that disconnects Mr. Stagg to this crime scene, such as the foreign DNA under Mr. Jennings' fingernails, Mr. Stagg has no blood on him and he's not injured. You have to come up with ways to account for that, and it's simply unsuccessful in doing so.
David Stagg tried to cover up his tracks, and we think he did that by putting bleach on his underwear to cover up the blood, and he knew that Bill Jennings had tried to kill himself before, so the only thing he could think of would be a suicide.
Reverend Mark Braden was the jury foreman.
Certainly a murder trial weighs very heavily upon you. I mean, you're dealing with a very important decision as to whether or not someone is guilty or not of a crime. Your stress reaches a climax as you head toward the day of deliberation.
After a trial lasting 10 days, the jury retired to consider its verdict.
There's always a concern
is the jury just going to fall back on, well, who else could have done it? And so while we were confident, we were always extremely nervous.
I've always believed that you can never tell until it's all over. But we were confident that we were ultimately going to be able to succeed and convict Mr. Stagg of this murder.
The jury deliberated for 11 hours before delivering its verdict.
When we returned to the courtroom, I stood up as the jury foreman, and I told Judge Anderson that the jury was unable to reach a verdict, that we were undecided.
The jury was deadlocked. It was a 9-3 split for a guilty verdict.
There was nothing that ever showed a sign of a struggle with David Stagg. That is what was compelling for those three jurors.
Emotions ran high on both sides.
From a personal standpoint, I felt horrible for the Jennings' family, who've had to live with the brutality of this senseless murder for a very, very long period of time, and the fact that I wasn't, quite frankly, able to seal the deal for them and get the type of closure that they so absolutely deserve to get.
I was disappointed and a little overwhelmed that we were going to have to try this case again.
The judge ordered a second trial. 5 months later, a new jury returned a new verdict.
9-3 for not guilty.
Another hung jury and another shocked courtroom.
I was not surprised that the second jury was hung. I guess we were kind of validated in that, again, 12 people sat down and couldn't reach a verdict.
There was neither victory nor defeat.
It was very tragic in my eye, you know. Who would have thought?
The verdict was obviously a relief that he wasn't convicted, but at the same time disappointing that he wasn't acquitted, and knowing that we might have to do it again.
After 2 hung juries, David Stagg was granted an acquittal. The case against him can never be tried again.
It was tough to look at the family and face them after that, knowing that the man who killed their loved one was never going to be prosecuted for that crime.
For David Stagg, his acquittal is tinged with regret.
Now, I try to look on the positive things. I'm an optimistic person. In a lot of ways, I'm a much stronger individual because of all this, and I'm trying to live a fulfilling life. But I wish there was something I could have done to help Bill. I loved him. I did love Bill Jennings.
Based on the forensic evidence, 2 Kansas juries could not decide whether David Stagg was innocent or guilty of the murder of Bill Jennings. No one else has been arrested in connection with the crime.
A vicious drugs cartel commit a series of murders, and agents must go undercover to bring them down. FBI Files is here next.